Let me ask you a question. What made Richard Feynman different? Not just smart. Plenty of physicists are smart. The field is crawling with people who have stratospheric IQs, who can manipulate equations that would make your head spin, who have memorized more formulas than you've had hot meals. But Feynman was something else entirely. He won the Nobel Prize. He cracked problems that stumped entire teams of brilliant scientists. He taught himself calculus at 13 from an old textbook. He picked locks at Los Alamos for fun while building the atomic bomb. He learned to draw, to play bongo drums, to crack safes, to speak Portuguese well enough to lecture in Brazil. And here's the thing that should disturb you. He didn't work harder than everyone else. He often worked less. He took long lunches. He went to strip clubs to do his equations on napkins. He played. He wandered. He followed whatever caught his attention. And yet, he consistently outthought people who were grinding themselves into dust. How? I used to think it was raw talent, some genetic gift the rest of us simply don't have. But the more I studied Feynman, the more I realized something that changed how I think about thinking itself. Feynman didn't have a better brain. He had better mental software. He operated on a completely different set of principles than most people. He had developed, through trial and error and relentless curiosity, a collection of mental models that let him see what others couldn't see and solve what others couldn't solve. And here's what excites me. These mental models can be learned. They can be installed in your own mind. You can think like Feynman, not because you'll suddenly gain 50 IQ points, but because you'll stop making the mistakes that cripple most people's thinking. So by the end of today, I want to give you 5 mental models that Feynman used to outsmart everyone around him. 5 thinking tools that you can start using immediately. 5 ways to upgrade your mental operating system. And I promise you, if you actually use these, you will never think the same way again. Let me start with the most fundamental one. Most people think by analogy. They look at a problem and they ask, what is this similar to? What did someone else do in a situation like this? What's the conventional approach? This is efficient. It's how we get through daily life without having to reinvent the wheel every morning. But it has a fatal flaw. When you think by analogy, you inherit all the assumptions, all the limitations, all the errors of whoever came before you. You're building on their foundation. And if their foundation is cracked, everything you build will be crooked. Feynman thought differently. He would take a problem and strip it down to its most basic components. Not what people said about the problem, not what the textbooks claimed, not what the experts assumed. He would ask, what do we actually know for certain? What are the fundamental truths here that cannot be argued with? And then he would build up from there. Let me give you an example. When Feynman was investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, the engineers and managers at NASA had been going around in circles for weeks. They had committees, they had reports, they had bureaucratic procedures. Feynman ignored all of it. He got a glass of ice water. He got a piece of the O-ring rubber that was suspected of causing the failure. He dunked the rubber in the ice water in front of the television cameras. And he showed, in about 30 seconds, that the rubber became brittle and inflexible at low temperatures. That was it. That was the cause of the disaster. The O-rings had failed because it was cold on launch day. Everyone else was lost in complexity. Feynman went back to first principles. What does rubber actually do when it gets cold? Not what the specifications said, not what the contractors claimed. What does the material actually do? Now here's how you use this. The next time you face a problem, stop before you Google it, before you ask what others have done. Ask yourself, what do I actually know to be true here? What are the fundamental constraints? What are the basic facts that cannot be disputed? Write them down. Then build your solution from those facts, not from assumptions, not from conventions, not from what everybody else believes. This is harder than thinking by analogy. It's slower at first. But it lets you see solutions that are invisible to everyone who's trapped in conventional thinking. Hold that thought about first principles because this next mental model builds on it. Feynman had a rule that I think is the single most powerful learning technique ever developed, and it's embarrassingly simple. If you can't explain something in simple language, you don't actually understand it. Not you don't understand it well. You don't understand it at all. Most people mistake familiarity for understanding. They read something, it sounds familiar, they nod along, they think they've got it, but try to ask them to explain it without jargon, without technical terms, without the borrowed language of experts, and they fall apart. Feynman called this fragile knowledge. It's knowledge that exists only as a thin layer of vocabulary stretched over a void of actual comprehension. Here's what Feynman did instead, and here's what I want you to do. Take any concept you're trying to learn, anything, a scientific principle, a business strategy, a historical event, a programming concept. Now explain it as if you're teaching it to a bright 12-year-old. Use only simple words. Use analogies from everyday life. Draw pictures if you have to. When you hit a point where you can't explain something simply, where you have to fall back on jargon or hand-waving, stop. That's the gap. That's the part you don't actually understand. Go back to the source material. Study specifically that part. Then try the explanation again. You keep cycling through this process until you can explain the entire concept in plain language, without gaps, without jargon, without faking it. Let me be honest with you. This is uncomfortable. You will discover that you understand far less than you thought you did. You will find holes in your knowledge that you didn't know existed. But here's what happens on the other side. When you truly understand something at this level, you can apply it in new situations. You can combine it with other ideas. You can see connections that people with fragile knowledge cannot see. Feynman could explain quantum electrodynamics to a room full of non-scientists because he actually understood it. Most physicists cannot do this. They understand the math, but not the meaning. Understanding the meaning is where the real power lives. But Feynman didn't stop there. And this is where things get really interesting. Most people, when they understand something, understand it one way. They have one mental model, one representation, one way of thinking about the problem. Feynman insisted on understanding things multiple ways. He would learn a concept mathematically, then he would learn it through a physical intuition, then he would create a visual diagram, then he would find an analogy from everyday life. Then he would try to derive it from first principles using a completely different approach. Why? Because each representation reveals different aspects of the truth, and when you have multiple representations, you can cross-check them against each other. If your mathematical model says one thing and your physical intuition says another, something is wrong. One of your representations has a flaw. That flaw is now visible because you have multiple angles of attack. This is actually how Feynman developed his famous diagrams. The Feynman diagrams that revolutionized physics. He couldn't visualize what was happening in quantum electrodynamics using the standard mathematical formalism. So he invented a new visual representation. Little pictures of particles moving through space and time, interacting, exchanging other particles. Other physicists initially thought the diagrams were childish. They looked like doodles. Where was the serious mathematics? But Feynman's doodles let him calculate things in minutes that took others weeks using the traditional methods. The visual representation exposed shortcuts and symmetries that were hidden in the pure algebra. Here's how you use this. When you're learning something important, force yourself to understand it in at least 3 different ways. If it's a business concept, understand it through the numbers, through a real-world case study, and through a simple analogy. If it's a scientific principle, understand it through the math, through a physical demonstration, and through a visual diagram. If you can't create multiple representations, you probably only have fragile knowledge. You understand the surface, not the structure. Now, this next one sounds simple, but I want to tell you something that may disturb you. Almost nobody actually practices it, including very probably you. Feynman had a principle that he considered the foundation of all good thinking. He said it in his famous cargo cult science speech, and I'm going to quote it because it's that important. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Let that sink in. You are the easiest person to fool, not other people, not your opponents, not your critics, you. Your brain is a rationalization machine. It doesn't want truth. It wants comfort. It wants to feel right. It wants to protect your ego, your status, your previous investments of time and energy. So it lies to you constantly. It filters evidence. It magnifies what supports your beliefs and minimizes what contradicts them. It generates clever-sounding reasons for conclusions you reached through emotion or bias. Feynman understood this about human cognition, and he waged constant war against it in himself. He would actively look for reasons he might be wrong. He would seek out the strongest counter-arguments to his own ideas. When he caught himself rationalizing, he would stop and ask, "Am I fooling myself right now? Is this actually true, or do I just want it to be true?" This is painful. Nobody likes to discover they're wrong. Nobody likes to abandon a cherished idea. But Feynman understood that the pain of being wrong is nothing compared to the cost of staying wrong. And here's the reward. If you practice this kind of intellectual honesty, you develop something that's incredibly rare. You develop good judgment. You learn to trust your own conclusions because you've actually stress-tested them. You stop wasting years of your life pursuing ideas that were broken from the start. Most people never get this. They fool themselves all the way to the grave. All right, one more mental model, and this one might be the most counterintuitive of all. Feynman cultivated ignorance. Not the passive ignorance of someone who doesn't know things. The active ignorance of someone who knows exactly what they don't know and treats those gaps as opportunities. Feynman kept a list of problems, a dozen or so problems that he found interesting but couldn't solve yet. He carried them around in his mind constantly, not obsessing over them, but letting them simmer in the background. Then, whenever he learned something new, whenever he encountered a new technique or idea or piece of knowledge, he would check it against his list. Does this new thing help me crack any of my unsolved problems? Most of the time, no, but occasionally, yes. And when that happened, he would make rapid, spectacular progress because he had been preparing for that moment, sometimes for years. This is the opposite of how most people learn. Most people learn things and then forget them because they have no context, no problem waiting to receive the knowledge. The information goes in and evaporates. Feynman's information had a place to go. It was like having a series of locks, and every new piece of knowledge was a potential key. He was constantly trying keys against locks, and when something clicked, magic happened. Here's how you use this. Start a list of problems, not trivial problems. Problems that genuinely interest you, that would make a real difference in your life or work or understanding if you could solve them. Maybe you only have 2 or 3 to start with. That's fine. Now carry that list with you mentally, and whenever you learn something new, ask yourself, does this help with any of my problems? You're converting yourself from a passive consumer of information into an active problem solver. You're giving your brain a reason to pay attention, to connect, to remember. And I find this both thrilling and practical because it means you don't have to wait for inspiration. You don't have to hope you'll stumble onto a breakthrough. You're building a system that generates breakthroughs reliably over time. Now, you might notice something if you step back and look at all 5 mental models together. First principles, the Feynman technique, multiple representations, intellectual honesty, productive ignorance. They all share something in common, something that goes deeper than any individual technique. They're all about having a real relationship with reality, not with your ideas about reality, not with what you've been told about reality, not with what's comfortable or convenient or flattering to believe. With reality itself. Feynman was obsessed with actually understanding things, not with appearing to understand, not with having credentials that suggested understanding, not with being able to pass tests or impress committees. He wanted to know what was really going on, and he would do whatever it took to get there. Most people don't want this, not really. They want the feeling of understanding without the work. They want the status of knowledge without the humility of admitting ignorance. They want to be right without the pain of being wrong first. Feynman paid the price. He sat with confusion. He admitted when he didn't know. He built understanding brick by brick from the foundations. And that's why he could do things that seemed like magic to everyone else. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want you to think about it. Which of these 5 mental models are you going to install first? Maybe you already use 1 or 2 of them, but I'd be willing to bet you're not using all 5. Almost nobody is. And I'd be willing to bet further that there's one on this list that you know you need, one that made you slightly uncomfortable when I described it, one that you've been avoiding because it's hard or painful or inconvenient. That's the one you should start with because the discomfort is a signal. It means there's growth on the other side. It means you've found an edge, a place where your current mental software is limited. Feynman wasn't born a genius. He made himself into one by ruthlessly upgrading how he thought, by refusing to accept conventional thinking when he could find something better. You can do the same thing. The question is, will you?